On the 17th of March 1942, over the steaming green canopy near Rabaul, Lieutenant Commander Elias Vance watched two more of his pilots die. He was the commander of Fighting Squadron 8, or VF-8, and his pilots were flying the Grumman F4F Wildcat. Below them, a Japanese strike was moving toward the harbor, but the lethal threat was at their altitude, the Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero. Vance saw one of his new ensigns, Miller, make the fatal mistake. He banked hard, committing to a turning fight with a single zero. The tactical mathematics of the Pacific Air War were simple, unforgiving, and brutal. The Zero climbed faster, it turned tighter, and it could outmaneuver the heavier, rugged Wildcat at almost any altitude. Vance knew from his own after-action reports that the Zero could complete a full 360-degree turn, approximately 16 seconds faster than his F4F. This 16-second turn differential was not a dry statistic from a flight manual. It was a death sentence, written in the sky. It was the exact window of time a skilled Japanese pilot needed to slide onto a Wildcat's tail, stabilize, and walk his 20mm cannon, fire up the fuselage until the American plane disintegrated. Miller's Wildcat vanished in a bright orange flash, followed by a smear of black smoke. He was a victim of physics. This was not an anomaly. It was the pattern. By this third week of March, the Pacific Fleet had lost 52 Wildcats in air-to-air combat since the war began. 52 empty bunks, 52 letters home. The attrition rate was accelerating because the core problem was not being solved. VF-8 had lost 6 pilots in just 9 days. Vance's men were brave, they were well-trained, but they were being forced to fight in an aircraft that was, in any turning engagement, tactically obsolete. The result was a one-sided slaughter, and it was breaking the squadron's morale. The official response from Fighter Command at Pearl Harbor felt entirely disconnected from this reality. The new doctrine, circulated just weeks before, was explicit: avoid turning engagements. Pilots were ordered to use the Wildcat's superior ruggedness and diving speed in what was called a boom and zoom, or dive and run, attack. This tactic, in a vacuum, was sound. A Wildcat could dive on a zero, fire, and continue its dive, using its superior weight to escape. But this doctrine assumed the American pilot had the initiative. Vance's mission as the commander of Fighting Squadron 8 on combat air patrol was defensive. His job was not to hunt, but to protect the carriers and transports below. This meant he could not simply dive and run when zeros appeared. He was required to engage, to turn, to fight, and to stay. The F4F Wildcat versus A6M2 Zero matchup meant that when his pilots stayed to fight, they died. The official doctrine was an offensive luxury for a defensive war. It offered no solution for a pilot forced to protect his ship from an enemy who could turn inside him every single time. As Vance regrouped his remaining 2 aircraft and pointed them back toward the Lexington on that grim the 17th of March 1942 afternoon, the reality was stark. The problem was not the pilots. The problem was the geometry. The official answers were getting men killed. Because official doctrine was failing to prevent these catastrophic losses, Vance understood a new tactical geometry was the only path to survival. The losses at Rabaul forced Vance and his squadron into a brief refit period at Naval Air Station Barbers Point, or NAS Barbers Point, on Oahu. For weeks, Vance was grounded, not by enemy fire, but by his own obsessive calculations. He was haunted by the loss pattern. He filled notebooks with diagrams of turning circles and firing angles, but the math always came back to the same grim conclusion: a single Wildcat could not defeat a single zero in a turning fight. Therefore, the premise of single-fighter combat was wrong. His focus shifted from airframe performance to tactical geometry. How do you defend a wingman when his attacker is fundamentally more agile? Every conventional answer failed. If the wingman turned away, the zero followed. If the wingman dived, the zero might follow, or simply climb and select a new target. The solution had to be cooperative, and, Vance realized, counterintuitive. The breakthrough came not in a cockpit, but in the humid air of the officer's mess, 2 weeks into his obsessive spiral. He sat staring at his coffee, holding 2 wooden stir sticks. He held them parallel, like a section of fighters. He used his finger as the Zero, placing it on the tail of one stick. He moved them. He tried every standard evasive maneuver. Every time, the Zero stayed on target. Then, he did something different. When the Zero attacked the right-hand stick, he turned that stick inward, toward the left-hand stick. Simultaneously, he turned the left-hand stick inward toward the right. The sticks crossed paths, passing each other. His finger, the Zero, dutifully following the right-hand stick, was suddenly pointing directly at the front of the left-hand stick. It was a perfect, unavoidable, head-on pass. He did it again, and again. The geometry was undeniable. If a Zero-tailed one Wildcat, that Wildcat would turn towards his wingman. The wingman, seeing this, would turn towards him. They would cross, forcing the enemy pilot, who was fixated on his initial target, to fly straight into a 0.5 caliber burst from the second Wildcat. This was the Vance Weave. It was also a profound violation of doctrine. Fighter combat, since 1918, was about individual skill. Pilots were trained to fight one versus one. You never, ever, turn toward another friendly aircraft in the chaos of a dogfight. The risk of collision was considered astronomical. This new tactic demanded something beyond skill. It demanded absolute, pre-programmed trust in another pilot's actions. Vance knew he couldn't propose this to command. He needed to prove it, and he needed a wingman who would trust him with his life on a tactic that looked like suicide. He called in his executive officer, Lieutenant Marcus Rain. Rain was a quiet, precise pilot who had seen the same losses as Vance. Vance didn't use diagrams. He grabbed the stir sticks. He demonstrated the weave twice, without speaking. Rain watched the sticks cross. He saw the geometry, the head-on pass, and the inescapable trap it created for the attacker. Vance began to explain the physics, but Rain held up a hand. He stared at the two sticks on the table for a long, silent moment. Then he looked up at Vance and asked the only question that mattered. When do we test it? The theory was simple geometry, but testing it against live Zeros would require a trial by fire during the upcoming Coral Sea operation. The theory, born of coffee stirrers, would be tested in the crucible of the largest naval battle fought in history up to that point. In early May 1942, Fighting Squadron 8 was deployed aboard the USS Lexington CV-2, steaming toward a confrontation with a Japanese invasion fleet in the Coral Sea. On the morning of the 7th of May 1942, Vance led a 6-plane combat air patrol over the carrier group. His section was split into 3 pairs, Vance with Rain, and 2 other elements led by Lieutenants Voller and Keene. At 10:22 a.m., radar contacts solidified. Bogies inbound high. Minutes later, they saw them. A large wave of Japanese bombers escorted by a heavy screen of fighters. Vance counted at least 18 Zeros. 6 Wildcats versus 18 Zeros. The odds were 3-1. This was precisely the scenario that had led to the slaughters off Rabaul. The Zeros began their high-speed dives from altitude, peeling off to engage the American patrol, confident in their superior numbers and agility. Standard doctrine dictated that Vance's pilots should brake, dive, and try to survive individually. Instead, Vance keyed his radio. His voice was steady, cutting through the static. VF8. This is Vance. Weave pattern. Execute. It was an order never before spoken in combat. A command to violate every rule of self-preservation they had ever been taught. The Zeros pounced. 2 of them fastened onto Lieutenant Rain, Vance's wingman. They crossed, cockpit to cockpit, with less than 200 feet of separation. The lead Zero, its pilot's eyes locked on Rain's tail, had no time to react. He had flown himself directly into Vance's gun sight. Vance didn't even have to aim. He simply held down the trigger. A stream of 0.5 caliber rounds tore through the Zero's engine and cockpit. It exploded in a cloud of metal and smoke. The first kill belonged to the Weave. The second Zero, stunned, broke off the attack, pulling up sharply. Across the sky, the other 2 pairs were executing the same maneuver. Voller and his wingmen, Ryback, weaved as 3 Zeros, dove on them. The Zeros, trained only for individual duels, were completely bewildered. They could not isolate a target. Every time one of them settled on a wildcat's tail, that wildcat would turn inward, and the hunter would suddenly become the hunted. The engagement lasted just over 8 minutes. The Japanese fighter screen, designed to sweep aside American resistance, was broken and disordered. They had lost 2 Zeros confirmed, with a third smoking and losing altitude. Their primary mission to protect their bombers had been disrupted. They disengaged, climbing away in confusion. Vance reformed his section. He did a quick count. 6 Wildcats had gone in. 6 Wildcats were returning. Not a single aircraft was lost. The Weave had worked. The Weave had saved 6 pilots, but Fighter Command remained unconvinced, dismissing the after-action report as an anomaly. When Lieutenant Commander Vance landed back on the Lexington after the Coral Sea engagement, he believed the debate was over. The proof was not in a theory. It was in the smoking wreckage of 2 Zeros and the safe return of all 6 of his pilots. He filed his after-action report that same day, May 7th. It was meticulous, a formal version of the coffee stirrer demonstration. It included diagrams of the Weave, notations on entry speeds, and the blunt, undeniable combat statistics. 6 Wildcats versus 18 Zeros, resulting in 2 confirmed kills, 1 probable, and 0 American losses. It was, he felt, an open and shut case for an immediate, fleet-wide change in doctrine. The response from Fighter Command at Pearl Harbor arrived 6 days later. It was not an adoption order. It was a bureaucratic dismissal. The report was logged, and the tactic was officially flagged as unorthodox and requires testing. No fleet-wide implementation was authorized. The Weave, which had just proven itself in a 3-to-1 fight, was filed away. To Vance, this decision was incomprehensible. To the admirals at Pearl Harbor, it was procedural. The entire culture of naval aviation was built on a focus on individual skill. Since the days of the First World War, pilots were trained to be aces, to win one-on-one duels through superior aggression and innate stick and rudder talent. Vance's Weave was the antithesis of this ethos. It was a cooperative, team-based system. It suggested a pilot's survival depended not on his own heroism, but on his geometric position and absolute trust in his wingman. It was a solution born of mathematics, not individual bravery, and the command structure, raised on the gospel of the lone dogfighter, simply could not process it. But the war did not wait for bureaucracy. As VF-8 was reassigned to patrols in the Solomon Islands, the slaughter of American pilots continued. The Zeros were dominant. By late June 1942, the fleet-wide statistics had collapsed to a horrifying new low. The kill-to-loss ratio for the F4F Wildcat against the A6M2 Zero had fallen to 0.5-1. For every single Zero shot down, American carriers were losing 2 Wildcats. The total combat losses had now climbed to 155 Wildcats lost. That was 155 trained aviators, men who Vance now believed were dying preventable deaths. The official rejection, paired with the mounting, catastrophic death toll, forced Vance into a position of quiet, determined defiance. Command had refused to make the Weave official, so Vance would make it standard practice himself. He began conducting unofficial training for every pilot in his own squadron, drilling them until the counterintuitive turn toward their attacker became pure muscle memory. He also began showing it to pilots from other squadrons, men who sought him out in ready rooms and on flight decks, desperate for an answer that wasn't in the official manuals. He was, in effect, violating the approved training syllabus, betting his career that this geometric trick was worth more than the regulations. This bureaucratic refusal forced Vance's unproven tactic to face an even greater test in the skies over the Solomon Islands. The Japanese pilots were not just skilled, they were veterans, and they were learning. They too were searching for patterns. By late July, Vance's Weave was no longer a secret. It was a problem the Japanese were actively trying to solve. The test of this new reality came on the 29th of July, 1942, during a routine patrol over the northern Solomon Islands. Vance was leading a 4-plane section, 2 pairs, from VF-8. All 4 pilots were now experts in the Weave, having drilled it unofficially for weeks. When 8 Zeros appeared, they were confident. But the Zeros did not attack in their usual chaotic, diving fashion. each pilot picking a target. Instead, they split. 4 Zeros held high, while 4 dropped to the flank, co-altitude with Vance's section. It was a coordinated, disciplined approach. It was a trap. The Japanese executed a multi-axis attack. The 4 flank Zeros engaged, forcing Vance's pairs to react. As Lieutenants Voller and Ryback turned into their weave to meet this first threat, the 4 high Zeros dove on them simultaneously from above. This was the counter tactic. Hit a single pair from 2 directions at once. The weave, as originally designed, could only defend against an attacker from one vector. It was geometrically overwhelmed. Voller and Ryback's pair integrity broke. Voller turned to meet the high threat. Ryback, seeing the flank threat, turned to meet them. For 6 critical seconds, they were no longer a team. They were 2 individual pilots. A Zero from the high group immediately latched onto Voller, hammering his tail. Voller's aircraft shuddered as 20mm shells tore through his right wing and fuselage. He was damaged and vulnerable. The Japanese tactic had worked. Vance, seeing the weave collapse, realized his solution was incomplete. The enemy, by using coordinated numbers, had found its flaw. His response had to be just as immediate. He keyed his radio. All VF8. Reverse! Reverse! Bleed them! This was a new evolution of the tactic, born in that second of crisis. Instead of just a simple, single cross, Vance and Rain, who were also under attack, executed a series of sharp, violent, energy-bleeding reversals. They turned hard right, then immediately slammed their rudders and ailerons left, forcing their heavier Wildcats into a skidding, unpredictable reversal that bled off speed, but snapped their noses in the opposite direction. The Zeros, lighter and faster, overshot them. The Americans reversed again. It was no longer a graceful weave. It was a brutal, defensive, scissoring match. This action, while not offensive, made the American pair an impossible target. It forced the Zeros, who relied on predictable turning circles, to constantly correct, overshoot, and lose their own energy advantage. After 90 seconds of this chaotic, multi-axis fight, the Japanese, having failed to secure a kill despite their superior position, broke off. Voller, his Wildcat streaming fuel but still flying, was escorted back. The squadron was safe, but the lesson was chilling. The Japanese adaptation was real. They had diagnosed the weave and developed a specific counter. Vance's tactic was not a permanent solution. It was just the first move in a lethal, high-speed chess match that was evolving with every engagement. The weave worked, but its vulnerability to coordinated attacks meant it needed a definitive, large-scale test to prove its superiority. The relentless, grinding combat for Henderson Field on Guadalcanal provided the final, bloody piece of evidence Vance needed. On the 20th of August 1942, a Coast Watchers report triggered a massive scramble. A large Japanese bomber force, escorted by 32 Zeros, was inbound. The air controller at Henderson Field patched together a desperate intercept force. 12 F4F Wildcats were available. By pure chance, 4 of those pilots were from Vance's VF8, which had been rotated through the field. The other 8 pilots were from 2 other squadrons, men who had been trained strictly by the book. This scramble created, entirely by accident, a perfect, horrifying control group for Vance's theory. It was an engagement that would pit the old doctrine directly against the new. The 12 Wildcats climbed to intercept. As the 32 Zeros dove on them, the tactical division was immediate and stark. The 8 pilots from the other squadrons did exactly what they had been trained to do. They broke formation, each man selecting a target, initiating a chaotic, swirling melee of individual dogfights. They were 8 lone warriors, outnumbered almost 4 to 1, relying on their individual skill. The 4 pilots from VF8 did the opposite. They ignored the chaos. They tightened their formation, forming 2 mutually protective pairs. As the Zeros swarmed them, they executed the weave, turning into each other, covering their wingmen's tails, and forcing the Japanese pilots into head-on passes or energy-bleeding reversals. The battle lasted for 22 minutes. It was a brutal, one-sided affair. The 8 solo pilots, fighting bravely but with a fatally flawed doctrine, were systematically isolated and destroyed. One by one, their radio calls were cut off, replaced by static. Their Wildcats, which had entered the fight as a unit, were picked off with methodical precision by the more numerous and agile Zeros. When the remaining American fighters finally disengaged and landed back at Henderson Field, the tally was sickening. Of the 8 pilots who fought solo, 6 were shot down, a 75% loss rate in less than half an hour. Of the 4 pilots from VF-8 who flew the Weave, 0 were lost. They returned to base, their aircraft shot up but intact. They confirmed 3 0 kills between them. The after-action report that evening was not a debate about tactics. It was a simple, brutal ledger of life and death. 6 men were gone, all of them adhering to official doctrine. 4 men were alive, all of them having violated it. This single engagement, with its stark 6-0 loss comparison, was no longer an anecdote or an anomaly. It was statistical proof. The after-action report from this single engagement was so brutal and so clear that it could no longer be ignored by high command. The after-action report from the August 20th engagement was not a request for consideration. It was a mathematical proof, written in blood. Lieutenant Commander Elias Vance was ordered to leave Guadalcanal immediately and report to Pearl Harbor. He was to brief the Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz. This was the reversal. The man who had been quietly violating training doctrine was now being summoned to explain that violation to the architect of the entire Pacific War. Vance arrived at the Pearl Harbor headquarters on August 24th, carrying his flight logs, his after-action reports, and the 2 original wooden stir sticks from the officers' mess at Barber's Point. He stood before Admiral Nimitz, a man bearing the weight of a war that, at that moment, was still being lost. Nimitz had read the 6-0 report. He had seen the catastrophic 0.5 to 1 kill ratio. Now, he wanted to see the solution. Vance did not begin with theory. He began with the problem. He laid out the 16-second turn deficit. He described the failure of dive and run tactics for defensive patrols. Then, he placed the 2 stir sticks on Nimitz's desk. He reenacted the Weave, just as he had for Lieutenant Rain months earlier. He showed the simple, undeniable geometry. The targeted pilot turns in, the wingman crosses over, the pursuing Zero flies into a wall of 0.5 caliber fire. He explained the energy bleeding reversals, the adaptation to the Japanese multi-axis counter. He was not a theoretician. He was a combat pilot who had found a way to stop his men from dying. Nimitz listened, watched the sticks cross, and saw the solution. It was simple, it was logical, and it was now backed by irrefutable combat data. The Admiral endorsed Vance's report and forwarded it immediately to Admiral Ernest King, the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet in Washington. King, a notoriously demanding and brilliant officer, saw the same logic. The risk of collision was nothing compared to the certainty of being shot down. On the 29th of August 1942, the bureaucracy moved with stunning speed. Admiral King issued Fleet Order 41-1942. The Vance Weave, as it was already being called, was now official, mandatory combat doctrine for every F4F Wildcat squadron in the United States Navy. This order marked a profound reassignment to training for Vance. His war in the cockpit was over. Admiral Nimitz informed him that he was now more valuable as an instructor than as a squadron commander. His new orders were to report back to NAS Barber's Point, the very place he had conceived the idea, and establish a fleet-wide training syllabus. His job was no longer to kill Zeros, it was to teach an entire generation of naval aviators how to survive. The Weave was now official policy, but teaching it to thousands of pilots across 2 oceans was a new kind of war. Lieutenant Commander Vance's new war was not fought in the sky, but in crowded, humid classrooms at Naval Air Station Barber's Point. His new enemy was not the A6M2 Zero, but the ingrained, ironclad culture of the American fighter pilot. By early September 1942, his mission was to implement Fleet Order 41-1942. he discovered that resistance from veteran pilots was a far more stubborn obstacle than any enemy aircraft. These men were aces, squadron commanders with confirmed kills and hundreds of flight hours. They had survived the early war because they relied on aggressive, individual instinct. The ace mentality was built on a foundation of one-on-one duels. Vance's Weave felt, to them, like a timid, defensive, and even cowardly tactic. It was a system built not to win a fight, but simply to survive one. It required them to trust their life not to their own skill, but to the position of another pilot. Worse, it required them to fly toward a friendly aircraft in the middle of combat. A maneuver that every instinct in their body screamed was suicide. One veteran commander, a man with 4 kills, famously stood up in a briefing and said, "Commander, you're telling me to fly into my wingman's guns. The Zeros don't need to shoot me if I do it for them." To break this deep-seated cultural and instinctive resistance, Vance's training syllabus had to be relentless. He and his small team of instructors worked 18-hour training days, running continuous, high-intensity workshops. The first wave of pilots, the initial cohort of over 800 aviators pulled from returning carrier groups, was massive. Each pilot was put through a grinding 72-hour intensive course that began before dawn. It started on the ground. Vance stood before blackboards for hours, drilling the geometry, using the same wooden stir sticks to demonstrate the head-on pass. He showed them the 6-0 loss report from Guadalcanal, proving that their trusted instinct was now a liability. The real test, however, was in the air. This was where the new doctrine fought directly with ingrained reflex. During one training flight, a veteran lieutenant, the same man with 2 confirmed kills from Rabaul, was practicing the Weave. His wingman, playing the role of the Zero, latched onto his tail. Vance, from his own plane, called the order, "Weave, execute." The wingman turned in, as ordered. But the lieutenant, seeing his wingman's F4F hurtling toward his cockpit, did what he had always done to survive. He executed an instinctive breakaway, yanking his stick hard away from the threat. Because his wingman was following the new rule, this instinctive error nearly proved fatal. The 2 Wildcats missed each other by less than 30 feet of separation, a catastrophic near collision averted only by sheer luck. The lieutenant landed, shaking. He admitted to Vance that his brain had screamed at him that his wingman was the enemy. This was the problem Vance had to solve. The training was not about teaching a new move. It was about burning out an old instinct and replacing it with new muscle memory. The pilot was grounded for a 24-hour cycle and forced to sit in the classroom, watching the stir-stick drills again. Vance used the man's gun camera footage in the next debrief, showing all 800 pilots how a single pilot's instinct-driven action broke the mutual support geometry and nearly killed 2 of them. This process was repeated, day after day, until the counterintuitive turn became an automatic, conditioned reflex. As this first, massive cohort of 800 retrained pilots began to return to their squadrons in the South Pacific, the data from the front lines, the only data that mattered, began to change dramatically. The 800 pilots Vance trained at Barber's Point returned to the fleet as a wave of doctrinal change. By October 1942, these retrained aviators were filling the cockpits of squadrons engaged in the brutal attrition battles around Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. The results were not gradual. They were immediate and stark. The data that flowed back to Pearl Harbor was no longer a trickle of anecdotes, but a flood of statistical proof. The most critical metric was the fleet-wide kill-to-loss ratio for the F4F Wildcat against the A6M2 Zero. In the dark days of early 1942, before the Weave, that ratio had collapsed to a catastrophic 0.5 to 1. The Navy was losing 2 Wildcats for every Zero it destroyed. By January 1943, just 4 months after the new training was implemented, the numbers had reversed completely. The new fleet-wide kill-to-loss ratio was 2.4 to 1. The U.S. Navy was now destroying almost 2.5 Zeros for every Wildcat lost. This was not just a marginal improvement. It was a fundamental reversal of the air war. It meant trained pilots were surviving their first, second, and third encounters. They were hardening into veterans, and the fleet was no longer bleeding out its most precious resource. This dramatic K-L ratio shift was not the only proof. The second, and perhaps more telling, source of evidence came from the enemy. Allied listening stations, like Station Hypo in Hawaii, began picking up new, frustrated chatter in Japanese radio intercepts. Japanese squadron leaders, who had once hunted Wildcats with impunity, were now issuing stark warnings. They cautioned their pilots to beware the American crossing tactic. Intercepted debriefs revealed that Japanese pilots were now being ordered not to commit to a turning fight against a Wildcat pair. They were to disengage if the Americans began the weave, because the maneuver almost inevitably led the Japanese pilot into an unsurvivable, head-on firing pass. The weave had, in effect, achieved the impossible. It had tactically defeated a technically superior aircraft. The Zero's primary advantage, its nullification of agility, was complete. That 16-second turn differential, the statistic that had been a death sentence in March, no longer mattered. A Zero pilot could turn as tightly as he wanted. It would only fly him faster into the guns of the second Wildcat. The problem was no longer airframe versus airframe, but tactic versus airframe, and the tactic was winning. The success was so undeniable that the weave spread beyond Vance's classrooms. The U.S. Marine Corps, flying Wildcats from Henderson Field, saw the Navy's success and adopted it immediately. Marine Squadron VMF 121 made it standard practice. The U.S. Army Air Force, facing similar agility problems with its own fighters, also took note. Pilots of the Army Air Force 35th Fighter Group, flying the twin-boomed P-38 Lightning, adapted the weave for their own high-speed tactics. Even pilots in the rugged P-40 Warhawk learned the principles of mutual support. The solution had broken containment from the Navy and was becoming a foundational principle of American air combat. The tactic had saved the fleet, and for his contribution, Vance received the Navy's highest honors. The statistical reversal of the air war was not just a data point for admirals. It was a revolution felt by every pilot in the fleet. By February 1943, the weave was standard doctrine. The kill ratios were favorable, and the man who had forced the change was formally recognized. Lieutenant Commander Elias Vance was ordered to stand for a formal ceremony at Pearl Harbor, where he was awarded the Navy Cross, the service's highest honor for valor in combat. The situation was, for Vance, deeply ironic. He stood at attention, surrounded by staff officers and admirals, while most of his peers were receiving their medals posthumously or on the decks of carriers. The citation, read aloud by a senior aide to Admiral Nimitz, was not for a single act of bravery in the air. It was for a feat of intellectual and moral courage on the ground. It cited his extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the line of his profession as a combat pilot and as an instructor. His development of a fighter tactic, conceived in desperation and proven in combat, had broken the enemy's tactical superiority, saved numerous American lives, and contributed significantly to the success of U.S. naval aviation operations. For Vance, the medal was heavy, and the honor felt misplaced. He was a combat pilot, and he was spending his war at a blackboard in Hawaii. This recognition, combined with the endless, grinding schedule of the training command, made him deeply restless. He listened to the combat reports coming back from the Solomons reports from pilots he had trained just weeks before and felt a profound sense of disconnection. He was teaching men to face a danger he was no longer permitted to share. This was not just restlessness. It was a form of survivor's guilt, an officer's deep-seated need to be at the point of greatest risk with his men. In early March, he took a formal step. He drafted and submitted an official request for transfer, asking to be reassigned as a squadron commander in a combat zone. He argued that he had completed his mission, the training syllabus was established, the instructors were in place, and the weave was now self-sustaining. His request went all the way up to Admiral Nimitz's staff. The denial was swift, professional, and absolute. It came back not as a simple memo, but as a personal letter from the Chief of Staff. The official response stated that Lieutenant Commander Vance was, at this stage of the war, more valuable as an instructor than as any single combat pilot. The logic was cold, corporate, and militarily undeniable. He was no longer just a pilot, he was a force multiplier. In the air, Vance could save his own flight of 4 or 8 aircraft. On the ground, he was saving the entire fleet. The numbers from the Bureau of Aeronautics, attached to the denial as a grim appendix, bore out this decision. The Bureau had run the statistics on the 6-month period before Fleet Order 41 to 1942 was issued. In that window, the Navy had lost 155 Wildcat fighters in air-to-air combat with the Zero. They then ran the numbers for the 6-month period after Vance's training program began. In that window, with the Weave in full effect, the Navy lost only 48 Wildcats. The math was staggering. It was not an abstract ratio. It was a quantifiable difference of 107 lives saved. That was more than 7 full fighter squadrons. 107 trained, experienced pilots who were still in the fight, still gaining seniority, still able to pass on their own skills. This data sealed Vance's fate. He was too valuable to risk. He would fight the rest of his war from a classroom, armed with wooden stir sticks, saving more men than any ace in the fleet. Though the war ended, the Vance Weave became a permanent fixture in military doctrine, evolving long after the Wildcat and Zero were obsolete. When the war ended in August 1945, Lieutenant Commander Elias Vance was 40 years old. He had a choice: return to civilian life, his duty done, or remain in the service that had nearly cost him his career, but had, in the end, embraced his revolution. He chose the Navy. The man who had found his calling not in the cockpit, but in a classroom at Barber's Point, discovered he couldn't stop teaching. His post-war career was no longer defined by personal combat, but by the relentless development of doctrine. He became a central figure in the new jet-age tactical development programs at the Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake. He was promoted to captain in 1952, commanding the Navy's first jet training air groups, and eventually reached the rank of Rear Admiral in 1961. He didn't just teach the Weave, he taught the philosophy behind it, that tactics must be designed to overcome an enemy's technological advantages, not simply react to them. This philosophy was tested almost immediately. During the Korean War, American pilots flying the new, straight-wing F-9F Panther jets found themselves in a familiar, terrifying position. They were facing the swept-wing, high-climbing Soviet MiG-15. The technology was new, defined by jet engines and compressed air, but the tactical problem was identical. The MiG-15 could outclimb and outturn the Panther at altitude. The old ace mentality of individual dogfighting returned, and American losses mounted. The answer, once again, was Vance's geometry. Jet-age fluid formations, while operating at far higher speeds, still relied on the core principles of mutual support. Wingmen were not just backups. They were an integral part of a single offensive and defensive system. Vance's influence was felt in every swirling engagement over the Yalu River. The Weave's most critical and enduring evolution, however, came a decade later. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. Navy and Air Force flew the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom. The Phantom was a monster of the jet age, a 23-ton twin-engine interceptor armed with radar-guided missiles. It was capable of supersonic speeds exceeding Mach 2. It was a technological marvel, designed to fight at a distance, firing missiles before the enemy ever got close. But in the skies over North Vietnam, F-4 pilots were being ambushed by the MiG-17. The MiG-17 was an older, simpler, subsonic fighter, but it was small, extremely agile, and armed with heavy cannons. It could outturn the heavy, energy-reliant F-4 with ease. It was the Zero versus Wildcat problem, reborn at 600 miles per hour. American pilots, trained for long-range missile combat, were being dragged into close-range, visual knife fights, and they were losing. The kill ratios in 1966 and 1967 were abysmal, sometimes approaching a 1-to-1 loss rate. The solution was not new technology. It was Vance's old geometry. Pilots, desperate for an answer, rediscovered the principles of the Weave. They adapted it for the incredible speeds of jet combat, creating a formation known as the Fluid 4. This was a two-pair system. 2 Phantoms would engage, using their superior speed and energy-bleeding reversals while their two wingmen protected them, and vice versa. It allowed the heavy Phantoms to fight as a coordinated, lethal unit, negating the MiG's agility. The Vance Weave had evolved. It proved that the principle that cooperative geometry can defeat individual agility was a universal law of air combat. Most remarkably, the tactic was still being taught at NAS Pensacola and Miramar under its original name, the Vance Weave, even as Admiral Vance himself was still on active duty, commanding carrier groups. It was, and remains, a unique distinction in military history. Vance retired in 1973, but his contribution is permanently memorialized in the institutions he helped save. Rear Admiral Elias Vance retired from the U.S. Navy in 1973. After more than 30 years of service, he settled in San Diego, living quietly, far from the centers of doctrine and power. He rarely spoke of the Weave, and when reporters or historians managed to get him to comment on his monumental contribution, he was famously self-effacing. He rejected any notion that he was a tactical genius. His response was always the same, a simple, unadorned summary of the truth as he saw it. It wasn't genius, it was desperation. It was the answer of a man who was not trying to win a war, but was simply trying to stop his men from dying. His legacy, however, was not quiet. For decades after his retirement, his phone would ring every year on May 7th, the anniversary of the first combat test over the Coral Sea. The calls came from all over the country. They were from old men, now grandfathers, whose voices were cracked with age, but whose memories were sharp. They were the surviving pilots of VF-8, and men from squadrons like VMF 121 and the 35th Fighter Group. They were men who had flown Phantoms in Vietnam. Each one called to say thank you, to remind the Admiral that their families, their children, and their grandchildren existed because he had sat at a table in Barber's Point, frustrated and desperate, and found a new piece of geometry. The plaque doesn't just bear his name, it bears his philosophy. 3 words that became the institution's mantra: innovate, adapt, survive. That is the professional legacy. The human legacy is written in the numbers. While exact figures are impossible to calculate, conservative estimates suggest that the adoption of the Vance Weave saved the lives of 2,200 American pilots during World War II alone. They are the humble origin of it all. 2 simple slivers of wood that, in the hands of a desperate commander, became the key to survival, reshaping air combat forever.